Bonjour à tous, bienvenue pour ce...
Good morning, everybody, and welcome for this round table on the very evocative theme, migration, welcoming and appeasing. I will introduce the four people who are with me, beginning with, on my right, Mrs. Ilaha Eli Omar, your co-founder and director of Uplift Afghanistan Fund. You were born in Afghanistan and you fled to the country with your family when you were under 2 months to live in the States. Today you manage Uplift Afghanistan Fund, which is an Afghan organization which works for the development of civil society and helps local communities in areas such as subsistence, health, women's rights, humanitarian actions, and cultural preservation. And Savinel Barras, you're president of Amnesty International France. Pierre Micheliti, on my right, you are a physician, graduate in public health, president of SOS Mediterranean, and president of Action Against Hunger. And right at the end, we have Sophie Magnis, your representative in France, in Monaco, and to the European Council of the High Commissioner of United Nations for Refugees. You're also a lawyer and a graduate from the Inter-University European Centre of Venice. I will ask to three of the speakers the questions in French, and you will answer in French. And Ila Eli Omar will speak in her native language, English, and you all have some headsets that have been made available to you at the entrance of the tent for the interpretation. So, as an introduction to this debate, I will leave the floor to Hippolyte Dalbiez. Good afternoon, everybody. So to introduce this session, I would say that the question of refugees and people who have been forced to leave their homes is a question that's very relevant to us because they live absolutely terrible disasters. There's nothing worse to imagine than to be obliged to leave your home. And this is what these people are experiencing. But it's also something that's relevant to us because it is an indication as to the state of the world. What we must understand is that for the past 15 years, the number of refugees, of displaced persons, has been multiplied by 3. If we were to remember just one indicator about the dysfunction or the horror of the modern-day world, this is what we should refer to. The question of refugees and displaced populations also questions us about our ability to welcome them. So I think that right from the beginning we can eliminate the question of cost. Of course, there's a cost which is associated with welcoming these people, but this cost is ridiculous. It is very, very low, given the financial capacity and wealth that we enjoy in our countries. We mustn't forget that Europe represents 1/4 of the world's GDP. We're infinitely rich compared to the cost that it represents to welcome these refugees. What is more important than the cost is to talk about the will to welcome these people. And I would say, to begin with, that for the past 75 years we've been committed. 75 years, and many countries, among which France, signed the Geneva Agreement, which establishes a framework for displaced populations and their welcoming in different countries. So the fact of having signed this convention it doesn't mean that we have to welcome everybody, and that's very important. Our objective is not to welcome everybody, but what this convention imposes is that we can't turn away somebody who comes to our country and who says that they're in danger in their own countries. We cannot turn away these people, and we instruct their demand. We examine their request, and if we consider that they're eligible to be protected by the country, in particular protection in France, we give them rights. So we're not allowed to turn away people. We must examine their case and welcome if it's justified. So it's true that the recent increase in the flow of refugees has made things rather complex. And what was very symptomatic was in 2015, where the increased number of refugees, in particular from Syria, really put pressure on the European structures. And one of the problems we have is that we have a custom or principle of the first host country. The refugee, when they reach this first country, it's this first country that must instruct the request and deal with it. And of course, this is very asymmetrical when you're Italy or Greece, because by definition, you are closer to the countries that potentially might be sending their refugees to your country. And I would say that in addition, the refugee doesn't necessarily want to live in the first country they come across. So the Europeans had to be coordinated, had to talk, which is not easy because the positions are not the same in different European countries. The positions can be quite different. And in over 10 years, we developed a European agreement on asylum that is based on a principle of solidarity between states. And I think that this is what we will be talking about today, this solidarity. This agreement is established in law. Very recently, actually, it was on the 16th of June that it was actually written into our laws. And what really questions us is whether we can better react to the crisis. By definition, the migratory events are sudden, brutal events, and to know whether we can do this with better coordination. That's what we're here to talk about. Thank you. Thank you. Sophie Magnis, people who are obliged to migrate, recently and historically, what are we talking about here exactly? How in numbers? Thank you very much. As the High Commissioner for the United Nations Refugees, we saw last year that there were 107 million people who were forcibly displaced in the world. And this figure is somewhat reduced as compared to 2024, but it remains a very high figure. 117 million people who have been obliged to leave their homes. That means 1 out of 70 people in the world are displaced by force. It's a staggering figure. And in this figure, most of these people are displaced within their country. So they don't cross the borders, they remain within their countries. For people who leave their countries, who flee their countries, these are refugees. And there are 44 million refugees throughout the world. In Europe, I find that there is still this perception that most refugees leave their country, they come to Europe, or they go to the United States. But actually, that's not the case. Most of the displaced people, as I said, have been displaced within their country. Regarding refugees, people that are propulsed beyond the borders of their country, most of them are in the neighboring countries. So if we look at the 5 countries where we have the greatest number of refugees, we can begin with Venezuela, Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, and Sudan. Most of the refugees in the world come from these 5 countries. And where do they go? For example, for Venezuela, they are welcomed in Colombia. For Syrians, it's Turkey. For people of refugees who fled Sudan, it's Uganda and the other riparian countries. So the reality of things is that we can see that 7 out of 10 people who are displaced throughout the world live in poor countries or intermediate countries, not in rich countries. And that's very important to remember. What it's also important to know is that the people who are displaced by force have no choice. They must leave their home to survive. And when they come to a host country, they need solutions. And our work in the HCE is to find solutions for these people in partnership with the NGOs, the member states, and all of the partners. One partner that is very important for us, and one of the reasons why I'm here today, is the private sector. And maybe you know that humanitarian aid, the states have been cutting back on humanitarian aid, and the private sector cannot replace the state, but it remains very important. We will be talking about that later on. Yes, but I would like to give some examples later on of what this private sector can do. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. Anne Savinel-Barras, says the president of Amnesty International in France. Can you give us a quick zoom in on France? How many displaced people, how many refugees are welcomed by France, and in what conditions? In France, for many decades, we've been documenting the situation of migratory people in our country. And for decades, we've been talking about the refugee crisis in France, in Europe also, but France in particular. So why is it a refugee crisis? Because we are not doing anything to allow these people to settle after a particularly violent exile and road towards our country. So France today does not organise the welcoming of people who come into the country. And even beyond that, recently we've been turning them away from our borders. Whereas these people, as you say, have rights. They have rights even though they don't become refugees. They do have rights. The very first right is that of being able to request asylum. We cannot prejudge the justification of a request for asylum if it has not been seriously examined and in the light of what the person has experienced in their own country. And when we talk about the right to asylum, it also means the right to recourse if the refugee status is refused. We also say that in this right to asylum, there is a right not to be turned away at the border, whereas this is what is happening in France currently. And beyond this right to asylum, there is another right, which is valid for every human being on this planet, is that of having access to water, food, shelter, heating during winter. I come from regions of the north. I'm from the Pas-de-Calais, so I know what I'm talking about. I am a living testimony of what the migrants are living through every day in the Hauts-de-France department. They're prevented from staying in France and they're prevented from going to the UK, the country that they would prefer to go to for family reasons or questions of language, etc. And therefore to prevent them to leave, preventing them from staying here, and they live in terrifying situation. Thank you very much. Ilaha Eli Omar, can you tell us about your own life, your own experience as a migrant, as a refugee? It is a very emblematic, very interesting, very moving case.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm actually was born in Afghanistan. We left when I was 40 days old. I am a political refugee. We came to Germany. We claimed political asylum, and then through chain migration came to the U.S. I set up Uplift Afghanistan Fund shortly after the U.S. had abandoned Afghanistan, and we were working tirelessly on evacuating people out of Afghanistan, and we were working for weeks until borders started closing or routes started closing, and we started rethinking about how to help Afghan people because it just wasn't sustainable to keep evacuating people out of the country. So we started investing in community-led approaches and grassroots organizations, and because of that, Uplift was born, the organization that I co-founded. And I think a big learning lesson for me in migration is that it doesn't start at the border. It actually starts when people lose their safety, their hope, and opportunity.
Thank you very much. Pierre Micheletti, Je voudrais avec vous qu'on fasse un petit focus sur ce
Thank you very much. Pierre Micheletti, can you talk to us about what is happening in the Mediterranean and how the shipwrecks in the Mediterranean are once a name and a symbol? Yes, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, SOS Mediterranean. I'm going to be talking mostly about this NGO, but there are many others. SOS Mediterranean is 10 or so years old. And I am accustomed to saying that the migrants that we have to save are the symptoms of a diseased planet. If we look at the statistics of 2025, the three main nationalities that we have taken on board are from Eritrea, Bangladesh, and Sudan. I don't have the time to develop this more, but each of these countries is going through a situation that explains for environmental reasons, for great poverty or war, means that we find the symptoms of the misfortune of the world in the people that are taken on board the Ocean Viking. We've been around for 10 years. We've saved 40,000 people during the same period. In 2015, we developed an international surveillance system of deaths during migration by the International Organization of Migration that we consider to be quite reliable. And during the same period, 42,000 people have been saved. 35,000 people have died or disappeared in the Mediterranean. And what is counterintuitive is that the Mediterranean is the main location of migrant mortality in the different global routes. In the same 10-year period, the OIM identified 40,000 deaths, and which meant that the Mediterranean welcomed 40,000 people among the migrants counted by the international system. So this reality has not been supported financially by the European Union, but also because this is happening on its doorstep. But in addition, the European Union is tolerating a certain number of voluntary difficulties that are explained by organizations such as SOS Mediterranean. For example, riparian states are no longer doing surveillance. In 2017, 66% of the shipwrecks were identified by the Navy, and today it's only 5%. And so the surveillance system for early warning, the governmental system, has collapsed. Similarly, just as the European Union does not subsidize any of the humanitarian NGOs, and it tolerates that Italy imposes debarkation ports that are more than 1,000 meters away from Libyan waters. And that is where people are looked after. So it means a 6-day trip there and a 6-day trip back, which cost an organization such as SOS Mediterranean 600,000 euros of fuel that was wasted last year without counting the surplus cost. And this blocked the boat with this continuous to and fro, so 90 days, during which it was not able to do any surveillance or rescuing. So we're going to look specifically at each of your actions. I would like to begin by you, Ilaha Eli. Uplift began with the evacuation of people from Afghanistan, your native country. You defend human rights, women, you're a journalist, and at one point you operated a drastic change in your direction. Can you explain to us what motivated this choice and what it taught you about the failings of the current migratory policy?
Yes, as I explained earlier, we started right after the U.S. troops left Afghanistan. We started evacuating, and there are many routes open to Afghan people, and within weeks that changed. That changed drastically, and countries were just no longer interested in Afghan people, to be very honest. And these were mostly, at-risk people. And I think that's when we started to, and at that time, my organization wasn't born yet. I think at that moment, and understanding the humanitarian crisis, and also the 20 years of aid in Afghanistan, and how, the lessons learned, we decided to set up Uplift Afghanistan Fund, which is basically raising money internationally. It's a U.S. charity to send to Afghanistan. And in that learning lesson of 20 years of aid in Afghanistan, I think what was important for us was that in order for projects and humanitarian work to be successful, or development work to be successful in Afghanistan, and the ownership needs to be with Afghan people. And this is kind of where we were really strongly supporting community-led initiatives, self-help groups, a lot of women-run organizations, so that it's clear that once people feel safer, they have hope, they have economic agency, this will be a less need to leave the country and stay at home. And plus, most people want to stay home anyways. They don't want to leave. I think what was interesting in the evacuation time is that most Afghans didn't even have passports. So that to me was an indicator that most people didn't even plan to leave the country. It was really due to conflict. And yeah.
Ok, thank you. Anne-Sabine Elbaras, vous avez parlé tout à l'heure de crise.
Anne Savino Barras, you talked a lot about the migratory crisis in France. And, how do we see this crisis? And do we see it to different degrees in Europe? And why not in the rest of the world? Yes, France is not the only country to experience this hosting crisis. Many European countries find themselves in the same situation. What we can see is the quality of this welcome changes over time. Sweden, which for a long time was a model of hosting and integration, is currently changing because the migratory question is being instrumentalized for political reasons. And of course, everybody can see that the question of immigration is often the very first question launched by the political parties, and they generalize this discourse, a discourse of hate, of xenophobia, of racism. And in this atmosphere of rising authoritarian practices in Europe and across the world, rising xenophobic approaches, the different countries are moving backwards. There is one exception to this. This is in Spain. And we need to see what is happening there. After years of very defective hosting, today Spain is trying to do some very interesting things. So it's very important to look in the direction of Spain. Thank you, Pierre Micheletti. Within which legal and financial and human framework does SOS Mediterranean work in? So the legal framework is mainly carried by the rules of international maritime law, which establish a certain number of landmarks, in particular on the fact that coming to the rescue of a boat in peril is part of the moral and deontological requirements of any seafaring person. I would like to remind you that the association has saved about 45,000 people. We only intervene in situations that have been approved by the maritime authorities of the zone in which we rescue the people, meaning we are not proactive. And some people are criticizing us because they say we are helping these migratory flows, but we wait for the green light of a maritime authority, and then that have objectivized the conflict situation, and that is the legal framework, that of immediate danger. The financial framework is very simple. Our economic model is mostly, largely based on the generosity of the general public, such as you here today. No governmental funds, no European funds, and some funds from the territorial authorities grouped together in an association of solidarity. And the human framework, mostly mixed teams. They're very experienced Navy people who are used to rescuing at sea, and medical teams to bring the first aid when people are brought on board of the Ocean Viking ship after having been brought there by speedboats. So thank you, Sophie Magnus. Let's come back to what you were saying earlier on. Are there any French companies who engage on this question, and do you have any examples of projects underway to encourage the employment of refugees who come to France? Yes, thank you. There are a number of French companies who are engaged in France to try to find solutions for the refugees who come to France, because they encounter real challenges to manage to have accommodation, to learn French language, to manage to find jobs. And this is what we did this week in Place Beauvau in Paris with the Minister of the Interior, Minister of Labour, the CCE France. We launched the very first edition of a enterprise with refugees prize. And so to put the spotlight on companies that recruit, employ, and support refugees. It was an amazing event. And there were companies such as L'Oréal, large companies that work in construction, and which don't just recruit the refugees, but who know about their background. For example, a few companies do not ask for a CV. The companies help with accommodation and help them to learn the French language, and that is very good. And we launched this award to encourage even more companies to encourage refugees and to facilitate access to employment. We also have projects outside of France that I can talk about. Yes, out of France. And I would like to know what the feedback of these companies is. What do they say? Are they happy? Are they just one-off experiences, or do they reiterate these experiences? Thank you. Yes, they were great experiences. During the company award, we have one company that said that the employees that are refugees are very loyal to their companies. They stay with the companies. They have very varied talents. A lot of the refugees come to France, and they're engineers or doctors or teachers or professionals, but they don't have the papers to prove this. And so for the companies, it's very good because they can benefit from the talent of these people. And in terms of diversification in the company, it's also very good. Outside of France, for example, we have a partnership with Orange and EUTELSTAT to put in remote areas in the Democratic Republic of Congo to establish Wi-Fi to facilitate access to education for children in this place. So this is a partnership that we began, and we're managing this with Orange, and it was started this year. But that's an example of a French company that helps us a lot. And the final example is a partnership that we have with CGM, a very large company based in Marseille that gives us containers free of charge. And this helps us to transport humanitarian aid across the world, because maritime transport today is very costly, and this is a very important partnership for us. So a lot of French companies are engaged in this endeavor, and I'm here with open ears if there are any companies that have any questions to how they can get involved. Thank you very much.
In about 20 minutes, you will get the opportunity to ask questions to our speakers. Elioma, you saw Afghan refugees going back to Afghanistan once they were sure they could find some means of subsistence there. So what does it show about the real motives? What pushed them to flee and then go back? What does it mean?
In a few of our projects, we do community resilience and livelihood, where we work with local community members who request certain urban infrastructural development, like deep water wells, irrigation canals, roads. There are many villages that don't even have roads in Afghanistan. And so in one of our projects, we started noticing that migrants were returning from Iran when they would hear that there was work. And a big element of this project is cash for work. So local community members would be hired to work to build the irrigation canal or rebuild the home or the roads. And so they would hear that there's work in their communities and they would return. And that was a big indicator for us to show that with some investment in livelihoods, I think that's a way and a better way to treat the migration problem. So migration is not just about managing movements, but maybe investing in conditions that make staying possible.
Merci. Anne-Sabine Barras, tout à l'heure, vous nous avez dit quels étaient les pays qui accueillaient moins.
And Sabine Barras, you said that some countries welcomed migrants in better conditions than others, especially Spain. There have been surveys, investigation carried out on a global scale. So are there any administrative measures being implemented in France that could push migrants into becoming illegal? And to make things simple, can we say that the French state is fueling precariousness? Yes, that's what we think. The French state fuels precariousness. We mentioned people who work. And you mentioned graduate migrants, what we call talents. But that's not the people I'm going to talk about now. I want to refer to migrant workers who've been living here for 20 to 30 years in France and only have temporary residence permits. These permits must be renewed every year or every 2 years, and it is really difficult because your residence permit is just being renewed, but you must already prepare for the next renewal. And you're scared that the administration will not manage to renew your permit in time because it has too much work. And furthermore, you depend on your employer because your residence permit depends on you having a job. But if you want a job, you need a residence permit. It is a vicious circle. As for the employer, he must request a permit to the administration. So this is a vicious circle that doesn't help anybody. And these migrant workers who've been here, who are residents, then could remain without any permit. So they will lose their jobs, not because they're doing a bad job, but because the administration didn't manage to renew their permit in time. So migrants are then forced to leave while they've been in France for decades. And they are what we call high-tension professions, which are babysitters, helpers, cleaners, construction workers. And these workers are living in precariousness because of the French state. Pierre Micheletti, you mentioned the rescue work you're carrying out in the Mediterranean, and you rescue boats that are really full and overfull. So can you tell me how does a rescue operation work in practice? So I'd like to answer this question in a very peculiar way. And one of the goals of SOS Méditerranée is to promote the idea that a rescue operation shouldn't be supported by a few operators. There are many other actors like the National Navy and other players that could help. And that could help us carry out many more rescue operations. And now I answer to your question. National fleet do not intervene, and this is a result of riparian state decisions. Boat captain choose to not intervene, although it is their deontological obligation, and this is the result of other mechanisms. They do not have the necessary know-how nor skills to do this rescue operation. We've been carried out for 10 years. And I'll give you 2 examples of this. Last summer, I was on board on a boat, and our teams have two types of analysis. So first of all, you look at the boat you need to rescue. There are some boats who are really fragile, but a wooden boat isn't the same as an inflatable boat, or even die-cast boats that could be destroyed by a small shock. So we need to look at the kind of boat we want to rescue, and this is a key part of our rescue operation. You need to look at the sea, at its situation too. And then there is the notion of mass rescue, which means that contrary to what can happen in a fishing boat, with these boats, there can be up to 10 persons per square meters. They're not given any life jacket, because if they were given life jacket, this boat couldn't carry as many people and they wouldn't be as profitable. So it is better to get 50 people on board than only 10 with life jackets. And experienced lifeguards know how to resuscitate people. They knew how to deal with many people on board. And when we rescue boats, they are really people are scared. You need to see how you can approach the boat. You need to decide if you will evacuate women and children first or not. So knowing mass movement is crucial in our expertise. So much so that one of the avenues we've contemplated is to help the Navy get more training course so that they can know what to do when they rescue a boat. Ila Elioma, you were a refugee, and now your organization fights the conditions that we push people to flee their homes. So what have your experience teach you about everything we criticize the Western world about in this debate?
Yes, thank you. I mean, this topic of conversation is kind of very impactful in my life, on my personal and career. As I mentioned before, I am a political refugee, and ending up in the U.S. afforded me the opportunities to go build a career so I can go back and help those people who are in the very same situation my family was when we had to leave Afghanistan. I think we underestimate the power of refugees and diaspora communities. I think when they're given opportunity, when they're felt safe and welcomed, I think they can make a contribution to the country in general. I think my story, with my own life story and uplift, is an example to that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais terminer par une
And to end with, I have a question for all of you. In 7 or 10 years, what will be the situation about international and climate migrations? Will migration flows be more organized, better accepted, and better integrated in the host countries, or are you pessimistic about it? So let's start with Sophie Maganis. What will be the future like? Rather positive or negative? I'm quite optimistic. Indeed, there's a new High Commissioner that took office last January, Mr. Barham Salih. He was a refugee. He was also the president of Iraq. When he started working for the HCR, he shared his vision, which is to reduce by half the number of refugees in the world in 10 years. And he targets refugees who depend on humanitarian aid. This has got an ambitious target, as there's nothing we can control at the HCR, but it will require partnership with all players. The High Commissioner would like to prevent others from having the experience he had as a refugee. It was really difficult for him to access education and job. So the HCR will work for migrants, and we don't want them to live in the same camp for 10 years. And this goes for Bangladeshi refugees in Myanmar. So we want to work with our partners to find solutions to restore migrants' dignity. Migrants have talent, they have a role to play in the world, and this is our vision of a change that could help them rebuild their lives in dignity. Thank you. Anne Savinel Barras, are you optimistic too? Yes, we need to be optimistic. I'm not as optimistic about the reduction of migration flows. The countries that host the highest numbers of refugees are riparian states or states that are just right by other states that are affected by climate change. So we fear that the climate crisis will lead to new migration flows to riparian states that very often are not wealthy enough to welcome migrants adequately. However, I want to be optimistic. I think we are more aware, and there's a rising migratory pressure, which means we must realize we cannot close our doors, although Europe doesn't welcome all the refugees in the world. But we could also help states that are right beside those countries of origin, and we could do more, much more than what we do currently. Ilaha Eliomar, I'd ask you the same questions. What do you envision for the next decade? Are you optimistic, or is there resignation?
I have to be optimistic. I'm Afghan. I have no other choice. Climate change is a real problem. Go ahead. But it's a real problem in Afghanistan. And there's a huge internally displaced community, as you were mentioning, Sophie, before. Due to climate shocks, we have started implementing climate resilience education in parallel with the urban development projects, because we feel like it is so essential and it is so important. And we've tied it in with Islamic frameworks of stewardship of land, so that people can really understand what is happening, relate to it, and understand how to be more resilient against it. Unfortunately, at the same time in the US, these environmental organizations that could support such projects, their budgets are being slashed, and we're up against, politically challenges. I hope that governments and countries like France, who takes climate change extremely seriously, that change happens in the US. But I'm worried, but that doesn't mean we're going to not stop trying to help and do what we can to just make it a safer place.
Thank you. Et vous, Pierre Micheletti, la Méditerranée dans 7-10 ans?
Pierre Micheletti, what will happen in the Mediterranean in 10 years? I started my speech saying that the Mediterranean is the center of all the world's misfortunes. But I think that the reason that push people to cross the Mediterranean won't change. It is the result of the evolution of major political regimes. And we've seen it in the US or in Europe. There's this idea that we cannot host all the world's misfortune. There's this idea that we need to close our borders to fight interdependencies. So if we push this idea forward, then we'll face issues, because building walls will turn us away from the situation getting worse in the world, with deforestation, for example, with new animal disease. We will not see poverty in the rest of the world. We will be isolated, and that's why we are replacing the development aid today, because we are all convinced that what is good for the others is good for us, and that other people will stay home when they can have a decent life home, because that's what will happen. If you have a decent way, if you're safe in your country, then you will not go away. And here's an example. With the African continent, which accounts for 12% of the world's population in 2015, 25% of the world's population by 2050, and the projection by 2100, the continent will account for 40% of the world's population. And the African population will go through major changes. Do you think that these people will stay where they are if they can't take advantage of economic development? And it has been documented that you can control demographics in two ways: granting access to education for young girls and a good level of development for people. So if we don't ensure these two things in Africa, then people will leave. And we feel that we are protected from the symptoms they could generate. Thank you. Are there any questions for any speaker? I see a lady in white on the right. Good morning, I'm Celia from the youth program. Thank you for your speeches. I had a question for Anne Savinal-Barras. You mentioned Spain that put forward solutions to better integrate migrants. Are there any examples? You want to know how it works in Spain, right? So I will not provide you with much details about Spain, but there's awareness. Spain is aware that they must welcome and integrate a migrant adequately, because migrants come to Spain and want to settle there, so they need a job. And there are many professions that need workers, so migrants usually take on their jobs. So Spain is aware that migrants have specific needs and that could support the economy of the country. And that's what happened in Germany until a few years ago, where there was a rising awareness that migrants need to work together to integrate the society, but it's about political will. And here's a last question before giving back the mic to Hippolyte. Over to you, gentlemen. Good evening. Thank you for this session. As for the history, thank you for telling us the story of immigration in the Mediterranean. How can we find a strategy in between Europe and Africa using raw materials? You said that there are people starving. Some women sell their bodies on boats while crossing the Mediterranean to reach Europe. We must find a solution. I think this question is for you, Pierre. You're only more than 2 minutes to provide an answer, but Anne wanted to answer. We must create legal migration pathways, because if migrants are mistreated by traffickers nowadays, it is because they can't access legal migration avenues. And we have been advocated for these legal avenues for years because they will help us prevent all these disasters. And obviously there is the question of development in countries of origin, countries people flee from. Let's not forget the question of climate change, of armed conflicts, of discrimination, of authoritarian regimes who are harming people. People are forced to flee to survive. That's the only choice they have. Pierre, you have 30 seconds. Let's talk about Africa. When the US cut the development aid, they removed millions of dollars of aid from the continent. And there's figures who was the deputy director of the World Bank that said, stop crying because the US cuts their development aid. Let's start by restoring an honest governance in African states. Let's start collecting tax on the various equipments that must be removed from Africa to make a few families richer. So let's do that before asking for money to the Western world. You have 30 seconds. Thank you. I think that France is focused on investing in Africa, but it's also humanitarian and development aid, which are crucial. And a final word on legal migration avenues. There is a relocation program in France that targeted 3,000 people a year. Now it targets 600 people a year. Thank you very much. And Hippolyte, a word of conclusion. Thank you all for... I must admit that I'm a little frustrated because there has been no representative of the states who support these policies. And I'm not saying that they have an easy job and all the public policy is doomed to fail. We all know it. But when it comes to migration, failure leads to issues, especially political issues. It is a sensitive topic, and it is even more complex to implement these policies. And as we've heard in previous panels, there is an opposition between the state who support public policy and all the other players, whether they are organizations or NGOs. And quite surprisingly so, because all players should come together to reach the same goal. But unfortunately, they are in conflict. However, progress has been made. For example, it takes the timeline to get an asylum request being instructed is much shorter. Then we have been digitalizing the procedures so that people don't have to wait in line in front of the administration office. So progress has been made. But there are also people in the administration that are showing humanity, and I wish there would be more cooperation between the states and associations. So I was asked to end this panel at 5 to 4, and I was successful. Thank you very much. Have a good day.